much. I correctly anticipated that by the time we got to me, there would be so much said that I should not have slides because much of what I would have said on slides has already been said. So I will try to pick up on some of the themes that have already come up, but in connection with them, go a little bit further in several dimensions. I first want to sort of repeat what I think everybody knows, but it's always worth saying that the relationship of trade and growth goes back way before 1980 or 1950 or whatever. It goes way back to the Industrial Revolution. And of course, the development of steam power for ships and things like that. We had 2% of goods traded internationally in 1800. We now have something over 23%, depending on how you count. I didn't say goods and services, I said goods. And I think that is the correct number, although I do want to point out that when exports and imports are counted, there is some double counting in that figure, which sometimes gets ignored, which may be important. Be that as it may, the growth of trade has clearly been the central part of the growth of living standards and the ascent of man from what we were to the current day and age. All the data suggests that as between 1500 years before the Common Era and 1500 years after the Common Era, there was almost no change in living standards in Egypt or in England, and they weren't that different. Only since about 1700 have we seen part of the world diverge from what was a common, relatively stagnant standard of living, including things like life expectancy and so on for everybody. And when we talk about the world, the ascent of man, we talk about things like increased life expectancy, increased educational attainments, better nutrition, etc. All of the things that have been delivered have had as part of them the growth of real GDP, which has been importantly affected by trade. So that when we talk about what's happening in trade, we're talking about what will happen to world growth and all these other indicators as well. That much said, to have trade going, I think everybody would recognize that we have to have some kind of international rule of law, much as we do domestically. You cannot have domestic trade without some kind of a commercial code in the background for the settlement of disputes, for recognition of contracts and enforcement of contracts. The same is true internationally. And what happened after World War II that was so important, among other things, was, of course, the founding of the GATT, now the WTO, which is a successor organization. The WTO, as Annabelle has already pointed out, has a very important role to play. Its fundamental principles, which need to be remembered, are that there's going to be non-discrimination among countries, that there will be national treatment within each country of the traders from other countries, and that there will be open trade regimes, meaning that we will not have hidden trade barriers. We will have the rule of law. And that's been vital to the growth of the international economy and international finance and everything else since World War II. Now, we worry about the current setbacks in terms of economic nationalism. We should be worried about them because it's crucial to future growth. But it seems to me it's important to remember that we have always had a battle, I think, between markets and the gains that will be had from increasing integration, which lead to profitable opportunities within markets, which have then been pressures for more globalization and increasing integration, and those who are opposed to its political process, which seems to be scared of it for reasons I'm not fully aware of or I can't understand, which basically say that we need protection, economic nationalism, and so forth. That has always been there. It's always been a resistance. It is nothing new. I call your attention to the Luddites way back when they indeed were destroying the machinery, even for cotton weaving and stuff like that, which now is so taken for granted that nobody would think of doing it. And we've had that along the way. There have always been some losers. And of course, and I'll come back at the end to this, it is important to have social safety nets so that we can make progress and things like that. And one thing that may have gone somewhat wrong is the absence of a sufficient social safety net in terms of what's happening now. It is not an argument for increased protection, which is one of the problems we have at the moment without that. But let me continue. There are threats now, of course. Maury emphasized the Russian-Ukrainian invasion, and that certainly raises a threat. There has always been an issue because everybody recognizes they want to protect, quote, national security, which is said to mean that we will protect national secrets. Many of us have suspected over the years, however, that some of the things that were protected on the grounds of national security weren't really national security issues. I would cite a recent one, which is, of course, President Trump's invocation of national security is a reason why aluminum and steel imports should be protected. Even these aluminum workers of America protested that. It was so ludicrous as to what it was. And the trouble is, how do we set up to get a distinction between things which are, quote, legitimate interests and those which are protectionism disguised in another measure? That is true of national security. It's also true, by the way, of environmental issues. Lots of labor unions have all of a sudden become tree-huggers as they decide there's another reason why imports should not be allowed there. And we need to worry that we find, I think the important thing going forward is to recognize the value of trade, to recognize the role of the WTO, and to find ways which we do not sufficiently have now to distinguish between what I will call the legitimate interests of national security and what have you, and the ones that are really disguised protectionism and seized upon by the protectionist interest because it suits their cause. Now, one of the things that's happened has been, of course, that many of the countries have chosen to have bilateral trading arrangements, thinking that they are as good as the multilateral. They may or may not be good. They are certainly not as good as the multilateral. Almost every country that's in a bilateral trading or several country trading arrangement and not multilateral could gain from going multilateral. Someone cited the fact that Brexit was something was a protection, or sorry, was opening up free trade. Whether it is or not depends on what happens. Brexit was, the UK was in the European Union. As such, it had the European Union's border tariffs. If it really went to free trade now, it would have left a protectionist device for an open trading system. If instead it develops its own tariffs and has free trade agreements, it could go either way, of course. But the idea that bilateral or regional trading arrangements are a substitute for free trade is certainly not true. We lose some gains from that, and I think it's important always to recognize that. But in the interest of time, I have to go on. We need to do things, I think already Annabelle covered the pandemic, which I was going to discuss, where there has been evidence that indeed the gains from healthcare products of all kinds and health products have been so great that countries have overcome many of the instinctive initial protectionist measures, which is one of the cases I think where already the markets have shown the competition beats monopolistic government intervention in these things. But there are many more. I mean, we need the new things that Annabelle was emphasizing, so I won't go into those. Certainly e-commerce, digitally enabled commerce are important. Certainly services are becoming more important. I would just add to Richard Baldwin's presentation that much of what we call services used to be part of what was manufacturing, in the sense that many things that are now done in services and subcontracted are things that used to be done within individual factories. Large economies of scale have been gained by moving those to independent entities, but that makes it all the more important that we find better regimes for the regulation, or not the regulation, but for the international trade in services with reasonable regulations when we need them, as to standards and things like that. I think also we're going to have to find better regimes for measuring the standards, because they can become another protectionist measure, which people sometimes tend to emphasize. And as standards become more important and more sophisticated equipment, that becomes another important issue for the WTO going forward. So at any event, with all of that said, political scientists have long since recognized that when you have an international organization, if it does not reflect the political power of the major players in it, it will be ineffective. And to a degree, that is the world's trouble right now with the WTO. We have major conflicts in trade between the number one and the number two players in the world in the international trading system. And that is something that no international organization by itself can change, because those two players are each politically too large, and they need somehow to find ways to cooperate. It seems to me that some kind of an arrangement, much like what we had with the Soviet Union in earlier times between the US and the Soviet Union, is what's important. There were issues on which there was cooperation. Nuclear disarmament, for example, was one. There were some others. And some things, as it was pointed out, the smallpox eradication started in Russia. There are many more. There were issues on which it was agreed that there could be cooperation. There were issues that were more or less neutral, and there was back and forth tugging, and there were issues on which there was conflict. Somehow or other, that has not as yet been sorted out between China and the United States, and is terribly important. It's important for trade. It's important for the international economy. It is also important for some of the financial measures that Linda took up, and in particular, I mentioned, which Warren mentioned also, the issue of international sovereign debt, where There is no regime internationally, and it would be highly desirable to have one. In its absence, the Paris Club has been an informal arrangement of a number of the creditor countries when they're dealing with countries that have sovereign debt unsustainability and need some kind of way of restoring sustainability in connection with an IMF program to change some of the policies that led to this overly indebtedness thing in the first place, when there are such. At the moment, there is no such mechanism, and there has been difficulty because China has become a major creditor, which is fine, but then has not as yet agreed to participate in the Paris Club or do something similar to it, which raises an issue between the US and China, which needs to be resolved for international finance as well as other things. Annabelle mentioned, but I will mention again, the dispute settlement mechanism within the WTO, because it's horribly important to get that going again. The United States has certainly been a barrier there. Among the issues that could be put on the table would be ways in which China and the US could negotiate something on the dispute settlement mechanism with China, the joining the Paris Club or an amended Paris Club, and getting the political reality of what is needed to get the international trading system going in ways in which it would be highly desirable for China, the United States, and for the world to have it going. It's even more important now than it was at the end of World War II. Why? Well, because we have the environmental issues which affect us all, which no one country by itself can very effectively deal with. Carbon border taxes are here to stay, and they will be seized by protectionists everywhere if there is not an international accord of some kind through the WTO. The environment itself will suffer if it is not, and that's something that affects us all. So for all these reasons, I would argue that Chinese-American detente of some kind is hugely important, not only for China and the US, but everybody else, and that it would be important policy to push in that direction on both countries, not just on one. And I'll stop there and thank you very much.